Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kathy, and today I'll be creating a card using the stitched rectangle dies from My Favorite Things, the Woodland Buddies stamp set from Not Too Shabby, and a homemade rectangle stencil. I decided to create this card because Jamie from the Not Too Shabby shop has a challenge on her Facebook group every month, and this month was to create a one-layer card. And to make things easy for my one-layer card, I did cut masks out ahead of time. So using the stencil as a guide, I placed my masks down where I wanted them, and I haven't removed the release paper off of them yet. I just needed to use them as a placement guide so I would know where to put my stamps. I placed the stamps on top of my masks, and after about 5 minutes of fiddling around with the Ladybug, I brought the rectangle stencil back in just to make sure that I had them where I wanted them to be, and then closed the door to my stamp platform to pick up the stamps. I inked up the stamps with My Favorite Things Extreme Black Hybrid ink and stamped the images onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock, and I had already run it through my Gemini Junior die cutting machine with the largest stitched rectangle die from My Favorite Things. After I had the fox and the ladybug stamped, I put the mask on top of the ladybug and then stamped out the mushroom. I stamped the ladybug first because I wanted her to appear to be sitting on top of the mushroom, and when you're doing masking, whatever you want in the foreground is what you stamp first. I did stamp all of the images 2 times to make sure that I got a nice clean impression, and I had also recently re-inked my ink pad and I didn't want to end up with big black smudges everywhere. So that's why I was pretty light-handed in applying ink to the stamps the first time I stamped them. After I had the mushroom stamped, I then removed the mask from the ladybug and started in with the coloring. For the coloring of the mushroom, I started out with BV31, and I added that underneath the mushroom cap and a little bit down the stem directly underneath the mushroom cap. Next, I came in with E43 and blended that out just a little bit, and then came in with E42 and blended out a little bit further. My lightest color is E41, and for underneath the mushroom cap, I actually went from the bottom of the mushroom cap towards the center of the mushroom cap. And then I filled in the space on the mushroom stem. I did end up going over the mushroom stem with E42 just to mellow out that highlight right in the center because it was just a little bit too light for me. After I was done coloring underneath the mushroom cap and the stem, I colored in the spots on the mushroom, and for that I did the same thing with the BV31. Then I went over that with E42 and I blended that out with E41. One of the reasons that I started with BV31 is I've been reading a lot about Copic markers and shading, and I learned that by underpainting with the BV31, it actually will desaturate your darkest color and make it look more like a shadow. So that's a technique that I've been practicing quite a bit lately. I moved on to the Ladybug next. I started out with R29 and added that around the bottom of her body. Next, I came in with R17 and blended out the R29 just a little bit, and then added in the R14 up at the very top so that the top of her body would be the lightest. For the spots on the ladybug, I used BV25 and BV23. And for the ladybug's face, I did a very small amount of the BV25 at the very bottom of her face, so I guess that would be her chin, and blended that out with the BV23. I didn't want her face to be too dark. She has some cute little features on her face, and I did want to still be able to see them, and by going with the BV23, it's still a grayish, blackish color, but it doesn't totally obliterate the cute features that she does have. Then I had to stop coloring and think about what color I was going to do for the top of the mushroom because I couldn't very well do it orange or red because of the ladybug. So eventually I decided on going with some teal colors. I started in with my darkest color, which is BG49, And I started by adding a shadow underneath the ladybug, and then I went around the outer edges and brought that into the center just a tiny little bit. I also did a fairly thin line at the bottom of the mushroom cap, just so that there would be a little bit of a shadow there. Next, I came in with BG15 and blended out the BG49 and filled the rest in with BG32, and then went back in with the BG49 just to reinforce some of the darker areas. Moving on to coloring in the fox, I started with E08. I used a really light hand and just added that in the areas where I wanted the darkest shadows to be. Next, I came in with E19 and extended the E08 out just a little bit, and I did go directly over the E08 with E19 just to get those colors to start blending together. When I was coloring the bridge of his nose, I was doing upward flick motions, and I was trying really hard to make sure that the flick motions didn't all stop at the same level. I'm trying to get a little bit of texture into his fur, so that was one thing that I was really trying to pay attention to. The next color that I came in with is E15, and I did the same thing. I did a flicking motion from the bridge of his nose up, but then from the top of his head down, I did a flicking motion in the opposite direction. And again, I am going over the previous two colors that I had used just to get those colors to start blending together. When I came in with the YR27, I did the same type of flicking motions, but I was trying not to get the flicking motions too close together. I was trying to leave some texture in his fur. I didn't think that he necessarily needed to look super furry because he's a whimsical fox. He's not a realistic fox. For the fur around his eyes and his tummy and the end of his tail, I used E43, and I used that really very sparingly just along the top of where the white patches are on his face and then on the outer edges. I blended that out with E42 and left just a little bit of white space closest to the center of, closest to his nose, I guess. And for his tummy, I did the E43 at the very top and then just above where his tail is in front, and did the same thing, blended that out with the E42 and filled the rest in with E41. For the tip of his tail, I concentrated the E43 closest to the red part of his tail and along the very bottom, blended that out with E42 and left some white space at the very top of the white part of his tail, and then filled that in with E41. For the insides of his ears, I did use the E40s and then decided that I wanted to add in some pink. So I did a line closest to the fold of his ear with R20 and then went over all of it with R00. For whatever reason, I decided to do a second layer of colors on the fox, and I don't know that it was necessary. I think that he looked fine before I did the second layer, but for whatever reason, I came in and did a second layer of colors on the red part of the fox, and I still think he turned out pretty cute. He just ended up being a little bit darker red. So either or, I could have stopped with the first coat of the red. Well, I guess technically they're the earth tone markers. I could have stopped with the first layer of earth tone markers, but I kept going. But in the end, I was happy with how he turned out. Now that all of the coloring is done, the next thing I did was cover the images with the masks that I had previously cut out. And I don't think I mentioned it, but the masking paper that I'm using for this is Eclipse masking tape. And I don't think I mentioned this either, but all of the supplies that I used will be listed in the description below, as well as all of the Copic marker colors that I used. So now that the masks are in place, I grabbed my little homemade stencil and taped that in place with some painter's tape. And I did run that painter's tape on my hand just to get rid of some of the sticky, just to make sure that my cardstock didn't tear when I removed the stencil. Now this stencil, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is a homemade stencil. I've seen a lot of, they're calling them masking stencils with hearts and circles and hexagons. And I had some blank stencil sheets that I had picked up from Michael's. You get them in a 3-pack and each sheet is 12 by 12. I just cut it down to a 6 by 6 piece of stencil material and ran it through my Gemini Junior with a rectangle die. And I also created a few others with a polygon and a circle and a heart. So that's always an option if you like that look, and it's a way that you can save a couple of pennies just by buying the blank stencil material. Once I had my stencil in place, I did a little bit of ink blending with a makeup brush. For the grass, I used Mowed Lawn Distress Oxide ink, and for the sky, I used Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink. I wasn't worried about getting a perfect blend with the tumbled glass because it ended up giving it more of a cloudy sky look, and I really liked how that turned out. And then I did end up adding some blades of grass with Copic markers. I used YG17 and YG03 and just did upward flick motions for that. And I had the darker grass more in the background and the lighter grass up front. And I did leave the stencil in place while I did the grass just to make sure that I stayed within that rectangle. Once I was done with the stenciling and adding in the grass, I removed the stencil and the big reveal of removing the masks, and I really love how this little scene turned out. Then I decided that I kind of had to add some shading underneath the fox and the mushroom as well, just so it appeared that they were casting a shadow on the grass. For that, I just used C3, and I did a pretty light hand and just kept going over it until I was happy with the look of the shadow. Next, I put my colored panel back into my stamp platform so that I could stamp my sentiment. For the sentiment, I used VersaFine Onyx Black ink. After I stamped the sentiment and I took it out of the stamp platform, there was a little bit of an area where the mask left white space next to the fox. So I just used B000 and filled in that white space, and nobody will ever know the difference that my mask wasn't placed perfectly. Anyway, after I did that, I used my AdTech tape runner and adhered that to the front of a top folding A2 size note card. And then I grabbed my black glaze pen and went over the eyes and nose of the fox just to add a little bit of shine to his eyes and his nose. And then because the Distress Oxide inks kind of faded out the antenna on the Ladybug, I just used a fine tip black pen to darken those up. And that finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.